back there and start moving up here. Okay. Cecilia, Wainryb, and I'm Ken Jameson from the Economics Department. Cecilia from Psychology are, in some sense, moderating this, but we really want to stay out of the way. We've had 8 wonderful external presenters in the conference, in addition to the panel this afternoon. We have a number of the internal presenters here, as well as people who have been here for parts of the whole session. What we would really want to do is to try and open it up to discussion at the end and begin to get some kind of consolidation of what's been a very rich conference, but has covered so many different dimensions that I think all of us will be thinking about how to put it all together for quite some time. What we're going to do now is we have one of the difficulties of Utah is that it's very high and people get sick sometimes from the altitude. So we've lost two of the presenters in some sense that way, and so we're not quite sure what's happened to our presenter Dick Billsborough from North Carolina. He may have gone the same way, but we hope that he will show up. But what we would like to do, Dick and Patricia Fernandez-Kelly, ran out of time yesterday, and so we would like to start with them. And if Dick doesn't come, we'll start only with Patricia. But we'd like Patricia to just talk for perhaps about 5 minutes about some of the things she would like to say, and then we'd like to open it up for about 10 minutes of discussion with her on that. Because George cut the last session off a little early. I shouldn't tell you that, but he did save us an extra 15 minutes for this. And so what we'd like to do is to take advantage of a truncated session yesterday just to kind of consolidate that. And then we'll ask each of the panelists to just try and sum up in 2 or 3 minutes what they see as particularly important and particularly leading to the future and to policy, and then try and open it up to the audience. So if that is amenable, we will get started, and we will ask Patricia to say some words about
well, thank you very much, Ken. I first would like to say that this has been a wonderful conference, and as someone who organizes events similar to this one, not only do I want to congratulate the organizers, but I want to say that their hard work and their imagination is greatly appreciated. The combination of interdisciplinary presentations, the combination of outside speakers and talent from University of Utah, the bringing in graduate students to deliver their presentations, and certainly today's lunch, which was much enhanced by the presence of our Heartland organization, all attest to the thoughtfulness with which this event was put together. And I want to salute you, therefore, and thank you very, very heartily for all that you have done for us. Even as I say that, I must remark that I was so frustrated yesterday that I didn't have a little bit of time in order to interact and respond to questions, and I cried. And that's the reason why, in all graciousness, George Cheney is allowing me to take a little time today. I will not cry right now, and nor will I actually use all of my time. I do not want to go over what I said yesterday, because I think that time has passed. Instead, what I'd like to do is to address one of the questions that came up. I think the gentleman who asked it was Mr. Flores, in the context of a previous panel that focus on policy. And I gather there are 2 points that are worth reflecting upon. One point has to do with how can we as academics really reconfigure our findings in order to educate members of the political establishment. The second one is a better and clearer understanding of why the anti-immigrant climate has actually flourished in these times. I will address the second question before, because you see, when I was very young, I really did believe that people, if only they had the proper information and the results of hard work and research, that they would actually do the right thing. Now, I very quickly realized that that's not at all what happens. So it's, I don't think, particularly helpful to imagine that if only we as academics did a better job in providing politicians with the facts, that they somehow would look at us straight in the face and say, thank you, oh, you bright intellectual, now I have the facts. And I can change my position that I have really maintained for a long time, because my constituents really love my position, in order to enlighten the public. I don't think that's what happens. I think I blame us academics for not having had the foresight that Clear Channel had, for example, or that some of the ideologues on the right have had in appropriating some of the media. And in fact, that is one of the things that I would encourage younger scholars to do, to really position themselves in a way in which they can address these questions and reach a broader audience. But I do have something to say very quickly, and this is the one thing that I regretted yesterday, so I'm going to take this opportunity to bring it to your attention. One of the things that I do in my extracurricular capacity is that I chair an organization called the Latin American Legal Defense and Education Fund, LALDEF. And LALDEF, if you knew my own personal history, you would be very astonished that I'm even part of an immigrant organization. But I will leave that aside. Part of the reason why this organization exists is because local activists in Princeton, New Jersey, of all places, were agog, outraged, and almost speechless at the kinds of abuses that we were observing in our midst. In fact, I got so desperate that I was going up and down Nassau Street distributing business cards and asking people to call me if they had a problem, which I could have started a new line of business with that, and of course I couldn't do it much. But LALDEF is an organization that whose mission is to educate and advocate for the immigrant community in central New Jersey. And the one thing that I want to mention about this, also because there is a representative of the League of Women Voters here, is that I had the great pleasure of collaborating, of creating this collaboration with the League of Women Voters of New Jersey, and the Center for Migration and Development, and the Latin American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And what we did last year on June 25th is that we put together an immigration reform roundtable. And this was not about people making speeches or about people reading papers or about people actually speaking about facts. What we did is that we brought 21 experts around the table, and this included academics. Alex Portes was there, and so was Douglas Massey, but also politicians with very opposite and different views. Bob Patton, for example, the mayor of Hightstown, who has turned that place into a haven for immigrants, is speaking to Don Crescitello, who has been fighting to deputize police officers as immigration agents. And we had members of religious organizations, business organizations, immigration law organizations. And yes, we wanted opposing views to be represented. So I'm happy to report to you that we had members of nativist organizations, Connecticut Citizens Against Immigration for Immigration Control. And we had a representative of the Minuteman organization and the very Prince of Darkness. That would be a representative of the Federation for American Immigration Reform Fair. What we wanted was not for them to repeat positions that are already known to us, but instead to focus on proposals. So we created a document with facts, problems as seen from the left and from the right, and then proposals. And the idea was to bring this extremely diverse group of people to some kind of agreement about a specific legislative items. I must say that we, with that group of people, so it almost caused me a nervous breakdown, we found 6 areas of potential agreement. And we are in the process now to try to do this with a New Jersey delegation. In other words, to bring members of the political establishment with differing views into some kind of dialogue in order to identify areas of possible agreement. I think that's very useful because then it is them who are actually reaching agreements and making discoveries instead of being preached at. And as a result of that, we produced a 28-minute DVD which summarizes that roundtable, which we divided into 4 themes. So the whole discussion was focusing on border security, the undocumented population, the bureaucratic backlogs, and the merit system versus a family reunification system. And so I invite you, if you are interested in this, in trying something similar. And I'm very happy. I would love to have our model, which I think worked very well under the circumstances. It got a lot of local media coverage. And I think it's a step in the right direction when you do not have a microphone. And one last word, and that is that right now we are about to launch a campaign because, you know, once you start actually putting specific proposals to specific people, there's a lot of talent out there. One of the things that I'm interested in is a radio ad campaign, similar to a public interest ad campaign that will simply state the facts about immigration and disabuse the public or correct some misinterpretations. For example, the portrayal of first-generation immigrants as criminals. Or the idea that immigrants cause extraordinary burdens upon hospitals and emergency rooms. And most importantly, this is a very high priority for me, the idea that there are about 3 million children who have grown up in the United States without proper documentation and who are technically deportable. And by the way, that immigration reform roundtable was graced by the presence of at least 2 of those children. It was very interesting to see people with very extreme views still argue for deportation of people who were right there in the room. But I think that bringing them together it may be a step in the right direction. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I won't cry today.
Thank you very much. And that's a wonderful segue from the previous panel as well, and I think we will certainly want to come back because of those same issues. Dick, would you like to say a few words just to summarize?
I didn't cry yesterday, but I'm almost crying today because I've been treated too well here. I've been eating too much, I find. So I hope I'll be able to be up for one more dinner tonight. And I had one follow-up comment to what Patricia was saying. In Ecuador, where I did a study on Colombians migrating to Ecuador, both refugees and other migrants, there's a common belief that Colombians commit crimes more than Ecuadorians. And they collected data on that. And in fact, the Colombians commit fewer crimes than Ecuadorians on average. But this is, again, a fact that is not at all known in the society. And it's a widespread myth. You ask, even before the refugee crisis occurred in Ecuador, the image was, todos los colombianos son ladrones. And so it's completely false. There were two parts of my presentation, and I will give you a very short summary of the second part, which I hardly was able to get into at all. The first part, I'll wear sort of my UN participant hat, having been at a number of UN meetings in the last few years about international migration. And the importance of international migration for development is now widely recognized. Remittances are a part of it, but also just the flow of migrants and the flow of information back and forth, and the visits are providing substantial benefits. And from my perspective as a development economist, this is very interesting, and it's become very interesting also for organizations like the World Bank and the other regional development banks around the world who, until the last 5 years, never thought about migration, international migration, basically. It wasn't on their agenda, but it is now. And as I indicated in my slides, there are benefits usually to both origin and destination countries being countries like the United States, as we've been hearing about. So the policy conclusion out of that half of my presentation was, since both countries benefit, this is what we can say is a sort of emerging new international consensus at the United Nations, the World Bank. OECD was in these meetings. That represents 20, 30 countries. The European Union, almost everyone except, guess what? It continues to be debated in this country. We don't seem to, we have so many prejudices. So the other half of my presentation was, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion of this at this meeting, was that the state of knowledge about the determinants in migration, of international migration, is really very skimpy. It's much more skimpy than I think most of you would see. And we know roughly what factors affect migration and how migrants are doing. Most are doing fairly well. But we don't know the relative strength of these factors in different contexts, and therefore we don't have a very good basis for formulating policies in countries of origin or destination. And a lot of this has to do with the data problems and the complexities of getting data. And I talked about how census data are not adequate for getting the detailed data that you need for this purpose, that you need specialized surveys. To study the determinants, I had a humorous slide showing the people looking across the Rio Grande from both sides. You really need data from both the origin country and the destination country. And I've explained that. That's in the slides and will be in the final paper. It's also in a 1997 book that I wrote for the International Labor Office with people from the United Nations called International Migration Statistics. I probably should have brought it here just to show you that it exists. You can acquire this book from the International Labor Office still, and if you're from a developing country, you can probably still get it free. You need data from both country of origin and country of destination. You need to link and pool these data sets in order to adequately include the population at the risk of migration, which are non-migrants, and the population that is actually migrating. This is for studying the determinants. And for determinants, you need the data at the time the migration decision was made, or just before. Current data is totally irrelevant. So this is a complication when you're collecting data. So you're collecting retrospective data, which means you don't want to go back too far if you want to get detailed data. And so that links up to my data that I was talking about on how rare recent migration is, international migration. Internal migration, by the way, is about 100 times as common as international. So I showed you, for the example, for the United States, over a period of 5 years, you'll have about 2% of the U.S. population would comprise migrants within the previous 5 years, which is a pretty small part of the U.S. population. For studying the consequences, you also need data in both countries on the migrants who stayed behind, not the migrants who came, and the non-migrants who stayed behind, strictly speaking. But you need it at the time of the survey. It's most important. Getting both is also better. So then what was left out of the presentation was really a small technical discussion, which in 2 sentences, that to conduct the kinds of surveys you want in either the country of origin or destination, you need specialized sampling methods to try to locate these rare elements, which are international migrants. So you're going to need to stratify the population, find out where they're concentrated, concentrate your field work and your sampling in those areas where they're concentrated. This would apply to Salt Lake City or to the United States. And then the second step is to use two-phase sampling and the last stage sampling units, which I won't talk about now. And I noted several examples of how this is being done now in different places in the world. And I'll conclude with that. I mentioned I was involved in a project in the Netherlands involving migration to Europe from 5 developing countries in Africa and the Middle East. And the study I mentioned a few moments ago of studying Colombian migrants in Ecuador, we also use these kind of sampling principles. And the World Bank is beginning some large project work, and it's already done work in Sao Paulo, and it's starting to do a large project in 10 countries in Africa. They're going to try to do them all within 12 months, which is, I think, not feasible. They hope to try to use these sort of special methods to find households which have out-migrants from these African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dick. Then what?
I think we can do questions.
Okay.
Good.
Could we have? Why don't we have a couple of questions on this, and then we will get the rest of the panelists to kind of give their last thoughts or their summative thoughts, and then open it up to questions once again. So, are there?
You don't need to give it if you don't want it. Yeah. Some of them prefer just take.
Okay, great. So, are there questions to Patricia or to Dick? Deb?
Thank you. I'm very interested in what Patricia did with the Roundtable, and as a local activist, I wonder how you got people to come, especially those that knew that they were coming to something that you were organizing and they knew they disagreed with you.
Good question. No, that's an excellent question, because it wasn't so easy to persuade them. I drafted a letter explaining why this was so important, and enough came. But you're right. The problem is that most of us like to talk to other people who think and have conclusions similar to ours. But I think with the right tone and the right connections, it is also the case that some members of those organizations really want to make their point of view, as mistaken as it is, available. And we did treat them with as much hospitality and courtesy as we could. We afterwards had some exchanges over email that were not that polite, but the event itself was important because, and it's unprecedented, because part of what creates the present climate is there are people in this country who have superb ideas about what is necessary in order to rationalize immigration reform. But the situation is so highly polarized, not for lack of evidence or for lack of thoughtful people or for lack of a historical precedent even. It's because immigration, if you'll allow me to use the language, has become the new abortion. And that is a subject about which people hold extremely emotional perspectives and about which they do not wish to establish any kind of compromise. So part of what was interesting about this experiment was the possible identification of areas of potential agreement. And we do think that this is a useful exercise for members of the political establishment to participate in. Let me just say that we did in a morning a much better job than the Congress did in terms of producing at least the fundamental elements of an immigration reform bill, which in the case of Congress was destroyed twice, and it was a bad immigration bill. So I just think that, I just want to share this information for whoever wants to make use of it, because we have everything in place.
I very much appreciate hearing about that gathering from Patricia. I do want to let everybody here know, since many of the people in the audience may well be Utahns, that Congressman Chris Cannon did put together a group, a pretty broad-ranging group of people. I believe it was back in 2006, and they kind of hammered out an immigration proposal, which is the proposal which, as a congressperson, he would very much like to sort of work through Congress. He's one of our congresspeople who's very enthused about doing something with immigration in Congress. And if you haven't seen it, it is on his website. And I don't remember the name of it, but I'm sure if you search for it, you will find it.
Julie? And then why don't we make this the last question, then we'll go back to whoever would like to have a last word from the external presenters.
So I did have one additional question for Patricia. Yesterday, being someone who studies Guatemala, I was comforted by your assurances that we are now safe from Guatemalan terrorism.
We are.
Okay, thank you. So my question is, I mean, you earlier just stated that the link between immigration policy and knowing the facts, that's not the challenge. Because, of course, most policymakers, I think you're implying, know that all the fears we have about terrorism have really no real link to immigration. So then, what is the real reason why immigration has become the wedge issue that it has? Just because it's politically convenient during electoral cycles, or is there something else? And I think just by mentioning that immigration is the new abortion, you're hinting at something very deep, and I was wondering if you could expand on that just a bit.
I think the best short writing on the subject comes from Paul Krugman a few months ago in an editorial entitled Seeking for Willie Horton, which I am told by Paul Krugman's spouse, who is a member of my church. She was the one who told him to write. He did a very nice job. She approved. His basic point, and I really don't want to take much time, because this connects with an actually very interesting series of articles. I'm thinking right now about David Harvey, for example, about the way in which certain coalitions have been formed that includes evangelical groups, or the religious right, if you will, and certain segments of the Republican Party. So there's some interesting stuff going there. But the point that Krugman was making is that in an age in which African Americans are now not the major minority, or are a smaller minority than Hispanics, and in an age in which there is a certain exhaustion about the playing of the race card, which in Paul Krugman's understanding has always worked in terms of mobilizing the American public, it becomes really a matter of political expediency to identify illegals and lawbreakers and criminal aliens as the new kind of concept around which one can organize the American public. And that's what, in other words, there is a certain racialization here of particularly Hispanic and most specifically of Mexican immigrants. And so that to me is very well illustrated by what Tom Tancredo did. I mean, I know that you remember his fabulous presidential campaign with gusto. He really does want to create a 2,000-mile border fence, but what struck me, and I found particularly, well, left me speechless again, was that last year there was a particularly horrible crime committed in the city of Newark. 3 or 4 African American students bound to a college in Delaware were murdered by several immigrants. The leader of whom was a man by the name of Jose Carranza, originally from Peru, a 29-year-old individual. And the murders were beyond description. Now, Tom Tancredo took this opportunity to use this crime as an example of the kinds of dangers that the United States is confronting as a result of immigration. And he actually encouraged the families of the victims, which I think is preposterous, to sue the city of Newark for having become, are you ready for this, a sanctuary city. His point was that with the indiscriminate acceptance of immigrants, we are creating this kind of crime-infested situation which challenges American identity. Now, as I have written, I took a liberty of writing about this for a testimony that I presented before the governor, that's the New Jersey governor's a blue ribbon panel on immigration, by pointing out that although this is indeed kind of a replication of Willie Horton, a kind of a mentality, Jose Carranza hardly qualifies as a poster person for undocumented immigrants because he arrived in the United States from the country of Peru, which is not a main center of immigrants, and he arrived in the United States before the age of 12. Instead, what Jose Carranza may be a poster boy for is what happens to immigrant children and to children in general when they are living in bad neighborhoods and they face occupational difficulties and barred channels for educational improvement. And this is not about excusing the inexcusable actions of Jose Carranza, but there's a difference between explanation and justification. So these are politicians, in my estimation. Tancredo is the worst or the best example of people who really opportunistically are using fear-mongering in order to gain popularity. And I do include in that list other names, and some of them I mentioned yesterday.
Thank you very much. Let's then change mode, perhaps broaden out. Let's at least give the panel members who would like an opportunity to say a few words to synthesize or to make some suggestions or to thank the organizers or whatever, or to wonder what's for dinner tonight, whatever it might be. Give them that opportunity. And perhaps if Alejandro could be joining us up here, then we'll open it up to questions to all of them. So who would like to have a few last words? Yeah.
I've got, I guess I've got two observations. One is that whenever you gather a group of academics, nobody can agree on anything except for that it's the media's fault. And so on behalf of the media, whatever it is, I'd like to apologize.
Just
promise
one
that we will
qualification.
try
I think
better.
I just expressed my admiration for the media.
Okay. Second, I guess, as I listen to the various speakers, I guess what I'm struck by is that, what's the end game? What is it we all want? And I think what I picked up is that, all of us, whether we're in Canada or the United States, I think what we all want is to be a society that is welcoming, that will welcome people from around the world to come and leave behind whatever hardships they have in their home countries and to resettle and to become and to participate and to integrate and to enrich our societies. I think from everybody, no matter what your perspectives, I think that's what I'm picking up. Everybody seems to want. I think that's great. I think it's a noble approach to have. My point is simply that I think we need to also keep in mind that one of the ways that we make ourselves hospitable to people around the world is to in fact be mindful of security. And don't forget that people are coming from areas of insecurity. They are coming to our countries because they want security. And I think we have a duty and a responsibility to provide it and to make sure that we have mechanisms in place so that they can adapt. They can leave behind, I guess, the conflicts that they're coming from, and not have their children being radicalized and drawn back into these things, not have people that are preying on these particular communities because they're looking for money or whatever it is to support the conflicts back home. I think there's a tendency for us to portray national security as kind of inherently anti-immigrant. I think that's wrong. I think when you really think about it, that's not the case. We're trying to create a climate that provides security not only for those of us that have been here, but also for newcomers as well. I think we need to keep that in mind in making our policies.
Okay. I have had plenty of time to present my thoughts, so I didn't feel the need to be very vocal in the last day and a half, and also I feel that my voice is about to disappear, so whatever is going around in Utah has gotten to me as well. I am not an immigration activist. I'm someone who has experienced immigration on all sides of her family. I'm an immigrant myself. My family immigrated from Turkey to Israel. My sisters immigrated from Israel to California. My brother-in-law is an Iraqi Jew who immigrated via Iran to Israel and then to California. I'm a philosopher by training, as many of you know. In 1996, I finished a book called The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt. And as you know, Hannah Arendt is one of the biggest, most important theorists of totalitarianism of the past century. She says in a phrase that the two most important issues confronting us at the end of the 20th century will be the problem of political evil and statelessness. By inclination, I was not very interested in working on the problem of evil. I'm an Enlightenment person. I believe in reason. And I said, I want to work on this problem of statelessness. And that is how I came to write the book, The Rights of Others, Alien Citizens and Residents. And it is why I think I'm here today, but also it has been a real pleasure and for me, and also extremely challenging to bring to bear my philosophical education and also personal experience on these questions that have emerged in such an incredibly intractable way. For me, there is an irony when I look back into the immigration debate. When I was writing this book, I was also thinking very much of the experience in Europe. I lived in Germany for 10 years doing postdoctoral work, and I was stunned and depressed by the situation of the Turkish guest worker community there, and I did do some political work around this issue. I had been an immigrant in the United States myself. I then assumed U.S. citizenship in 1984, and I could not believe the contempt and still, contempt with which the Turkish community at large was treated in Germany after 3 generations. And I started, of course, reflecting on this, and the one big empirical case study that I did do in this book concerns European citizenship and the transformations of European citizenship with the formation of the European Union, which is very different than the models that we are familiar with. What is remarkable here is that some of the aspects of the conversation in Europe, which I had found exclusionary and punitive and criminalizing of the migration, have come across the ocean. And in a sense, it is as if the US discourse has become, in a way, much more like the discourse of continental Europe about immigrants. There is a kind of irony here. A very smart friend of mine who observes both continents said, after 9/11, you have become much more now like a European country. The oceans no longer separate you. You have become insecure. I think this is also fundamentally behind the question also of immigration. Something very crucial has changed in this country's self-understanding, in this country's place in the world, and the world has changed. The geopolitics of immigration are different. I will add 3 small points. This is a very long conversation. First, immigration is controlled at a national level, but as we heard in the last 2 days, the impact of immigration is always local. And this is another one of the incendiary asymmetries in the whole immigration debate, that It is local communities that have to deal with, you know, sick immigrants, undocumented immigrants, immigrant children, the whole problems and panoply of issues that communities that you have been talking about. And so one question is about cost sharing between national, state, and local communities about the burdens of immigration. There's a great deal that could be done here. There's a great amount of reform and consideration that one can focus on this issue. New Haven actually has taken the initiative and has simply issued identity cards to its undocumented migrant population. So Utah, I know, has had this program with driver's licenses. Many cities in the country are doing. You are not alone. New Haven has gone ahead with it, and the sky has not fallen. Second problem, this has something to do with the whole domain of international law, but it was brought up by the question of a young man to the previous panel who said, why is it that there are so many more privileges or facilities for refugees than there are for migrants? Now, one of another asymmetry, you know, in the whole immigration debate, since 1951 Refugee Convention, and its 1967 protocol. The states that are signatories to the Refugee Convention have an obligation under international law to grant someone who asks refuge, to grant them a refuge. That is the principle of non-refoulement from the French. You cannot send someone back to the country of violence or torture or whatever they have originated from. If you are a signatory, you have the obligation at least to accept that request of asylum and, you know, and test it. Now, what is the difference between economic migrants and political refugees? In Europe, one is today increasingly talking about economic refugees and political refugees, okay? This distinction is really, in many ways, an artificial distinction. The 1951 Refugee Convention was articulated in order to address anti-Nazi, you know, anti-fascist resistors, anti-communist resistors. But in many ways, if you are a political refugee, you are going to suffer economic discrimination. And if you may become an economic refugee precisely because you are suffering ethnic, religious, or other kinds of discrimination. So this is a very slippery situation. I don't think the legal instruments are very helpful for dealing in a world with that is in transformation. But if you talk to people on the field, like, you know, people from the International Rescue Committee, they will say, don't touch it. Don't touch it. We don't have anything better in its place. If we weaken the distinction between the refugees and the economic migrants, what we're going to do is even add more confusion. But I'm just suggesting this to you as an area where we can make perhaps some contribution into thinking about this. And final point, I just want to support Professor Portes. It was a privilege to listen to his wonderful refutation with also facts and figures of the kind of incredible stuff that, or incredible pronouncements that my former colleague Samuel Huntington from Harvard has been putting forward. It really is a shock, you know, to all of us in the academic community that, you know, a man who has contributed so greatly to social science in this country all of a sudden would really be targeting the Hispanic community in particular. And basically, it is social scientifically covered polite racism. He believes, you know, that the United States is basically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. This is the stock, and everybody else are just, you know, sort of guests. And if they behave themselves, they can stay here. But I just want to reiterate the suggestion of regularizing the flow of workers, the flow of migrants. Now, this regularization comes with one issue. One of the beauties of the American system in comparison to Europe and many other countries was that every worker, temporary worker, whose status is normalized is potentially an immigrant. We did not have the category of guest worker. And I think some of the price that we may be paying today in trying to regularize this situation across the southern border is in effect saying, let us make a distinction between migrants and temporary and guest workers. I see this as a political pill that one may have to swallow because we have to do something and we have to propose something that makes sense that the community can accept. But I, at the same time, am very regretful of the fact if we close the door to guest workers, temporary workers, of being able to transform their status and become eventually American citizens. This is, again, changing this country and taking it in directions that are somewhat unknown. Thank you, Joseph.
Would you like to make a statement?
Well, it's good to come at the end because then I can perhaps bounce a bit vis-a-vis the comments of the other panelists here, or at least some of them. Just 3 points on the first on Richard's very interesting comment, with which I agree, about 90% on migration and development. I think that we know a little more about the causes of the structural causes of international migration today, and many things have been written about. But in terms of the point that I would like to advance in the relationship between migration and development is that there seems to be a growing consensus that migration pays off both for receiving and sending countries when it is mostly circular. That is when to a large extent the circularity of the flow can be preserved. It pays off for the receiving country for obvious reasons, because the country can have access to labor, not only manual labor, but even professional labor, of which the U.S. is a great recipient or has been a great recipient in the past. At the level of manual labor without the baggage that we have today brought about by a mistaken policy, as I indicated in the morning, of bringing in entire families rather than workers for a period that can remit, can accumulate savings, and can return. It is, and this is an important point, it's very important, that is, circularity is highly convenient for the sending countries themselves, among other things because permanent, that is, whereas temporary labor migration contributes remittances, sometimes knowledge and so on, permanent family migration depopulates the country. And today there are entire swaths of 1/3 of the Mexican municipalities have actually lost population during the last decade and continue to lose it. So you have this spectacle of ghost towns all over Mexico, in the Dominican Republic and El Salvador, where people come during the celebration of the patron saint for a day or so to show off their wares, but practically there is no one there, except that it's old people and young children. And the young, if they remain there, their only future is actually to migrate as well. How different is that when you have that is when you used to have, because that existed in the past, a working labor system in which migrants came to the country for a while, young males, they did work in the harvest and so on, and they eventually returned home, where they grew families and where they grew children in their own country in conditions that are ultimately much better than when they bring them here. True enough, every migration flow creates a sediment for reasons that are that have to do with the way people are, that is encountering others, marrying, falling, that is deciding to stay. There will always be a sediment, even in a circular labor flow, and provisions have to be made for that. So actually in the recommendations that we have advanced, that is several of us at Princeton, Doug Massey, myself, and others, for a temporary labor program, there is always the inclusion of an avenue in the immigration Act to a provision for those who have to, a path toward legal permanent residence, and then citizenship. There is no temporary labor program will work, it seems to me, without first a path for those who want to stay, but also clear incentives for return, that would be voluntary rather than forced. For example, what about if after 6 years of temporary labor in the country with legal permits and so on, those who return are granted in a package the full amount of their social security contributions. Since they are not going to return to the country, they can be given that is a significant lump sum that can serve as a point for investment in the communities and the regions that they left behind. That would be an incentive to return that would be voluntary rather than forced, while at the same time allowing those who wish to stay a path toward permanent toward permanent residence and then eventual citizenship. That would be part of a rational and reasonable labor management program rather than what we are witnessing now. The other point that I wanted to touch about is something that Patricia mentioned. Actually, during my first visit here to Salt Lake City back in 2001, the topic of the lecture was our model of segmented assimilation in the second generation and how there were different paths with the children of human capital immigrants doing very well and so on. But at that time, we did not have the data. We had data as far as adolescents. Later on, we did a third survey, so we had the data to a large extent show what happens by young adulthood. And what happens, which is published in several articles and so on, gives clear evidence of bifurcation of what can be called segmented assimilation in the second generation. Not everybody is going downwards, and probably Patricia referred to that yesterday, I wasn't here, but not everybody is going downwards. For the most part, the second generation is moving ahead and is doing well, but a significant sizable segment is falling behind. We estimated in about 1/5. For example, what that is indicators of trouble in young adulthood among children of immigrants, among this huge population, premature childbearing. What is the proportion of premature childbearing among the nationalities that are relatively advantaged? Let's say the children of middle-class Cubans, the children of Chinese professionals, and so on. Close to zero. Close to zero. What is the proportion among black West Indians? 20%. What is the proportion among Mexican Americans by age 24? 40%. So the groups that are in greater poverty and more menaced with other things are the ones that are burdened at this early age by having children. The same with the most poignant indicator that we could find of these trends, that is incidence of arrest and especially incarceration. Arrest, you can be arrested for speeding, but incarceration, you have really to have. What is the proportion among the more advantaged nationalities whose parents were relatively well received in the country, who have high levels of human capital among Chinese Americans, second generation Chinese American males? The proportion of those incarcerated for a crime is 0. It climbs to about 10% among Colombians and post-1980 Cubans and so on, to 18% among second-generation Salvadorians, and 20% among Mexican Americans and Haitian Americans. To give you an idea of what 20% at age 24 means, the proportion of Afro-Americans aged 18 to 40 incarcerated for a crime is 26.4% as of last count. So with 60 more years to go from the time there is every indication that the same path of disadvantage and so on may be followed by these groups. to conclude, I think that afterwards and I think that this is an important policy map because it has to do with what we saw at lunch and the types of programs of community advocacy that are created here. I don't know if Patricia referred to this, but the last part of the study, because we had longitudinal data and could do it, was to identify outliers. That is, to find out, now that we know the whole thing and we know the reasons that lead to upward and downward assimilation in the second generation, what about the kids who escaped? The ones who managed to overcome such great disadvantages in order to, even coming from very poor families and attending very poor schools, to move ahead and actually graduate. And that was also very closely related to what you mentioned. Well, I cannot go through the different, but that is, we identified 50 cases in a sample of about 5,200, which is a lot, which is, about less than 1%. And it was possible, Patricia did several of these interviews and in detail to find out, and we found several paths. But the important thing that I want to point out is that a key factor in this was external, that is voluntary programs. That is external voluntary programs that lend a hand, because that without that kind of assistance, even children from families who want them and are disciplined and so on, the families just don't know. They don't have the information on how to fill an application, what are the deadlines, what is it to sit in a classroom, in a college campus, and so on. So these voluntary programs that are created that sometimes involve college kids to provide assistance, they do work. They do have the possibility of compensating for the disadvantages that are created for this population, as I mentioned before, a rather misguided immigration policy. Let me stop there.
I think we should have some questions. We're just out of time.
What a bunch of immigrants.
Yeah.
Stacey.
Thank you.
Your last point made me think of an
I think that's a compliment.
education, and there was a comment from the audience about, well, teachers can't do everything, schools can't do everything, education can't do everything, but I think, I'm a developmental psychologist, to give you my bias. One of the things we forget are these programs that sort of support the educational endeavor, and how do we rethink education to be more than just 9 to 3, where, yes, you learn math and reading and science and all of those kinds of things, to schools becoming what's now happening in Chicago, 21st century learning communities, where the school stays open and partners with community agencies to come in and provide services for young people, for their families, physical health centers, mental health centers, so that families and kids can actually go to the place that they know best to get their services met. Kids are taken care of. They're not hanging out by themselves. They're in adult or intergenerational kinds of programs. And there's this whole sector of stuff that's going on before and after school with people that are often have come up in those programs themselves. They're not highly trained, but they're passionate about working with young people and families to create healthier communities. And one of the other things that's going on in Illinois, I'm from Illinois, is trying to think about how do we educate those folks who are going around those edges of the school day to do the best they can in those situations, and creating a credential and all of these kinds of things. But I think we forget that youth development or education is more than just what you learn from 9 to 3, that we need to think about education as an expanded situation, and that schools can really, they don't have to do it all. They can partner with community agencies, but use their facilities as spaces to create those centers. So it's not really a question, but more of a comment and maybe reaction from some of the panelists would be.
I think it's quite important to understand that even if when those services are being provided, how many of those who are supposed to benefit from those services are able to use it? There are some constraints that doesn't allow those individuals that are supposed to benefit from them to benefit from them. And some of them is, for instance, if you have a mother with 3 kids in the house, and such a program is being provided in the evening, and the kids are back from school. How does mother deal with that issue? That's point number one. Then another issue is transportation problem. Where these things are, these special need, specific services is being provided, might be quite a distance from where they are, in a good case like Chicago. Even the one that's being provided in Salt Lake City here, by some faith-based organization, it's difficult for them to have access to those programs because of those two key factors. Really, it is unfortunate that the last panel had indicated that settlement programs in Utah is crisis-free. It is quite a falsification of facts out there. It is crisis-prone, fragmented, and uncoordinated. And when you deliver such service, such information to legislatures that everything is fine, then you have to wonder, how will somebody want to help you or give you money to facilitate a better program if you say everything is okay? So these are some of the problems with those things. Like in Utah here, it's presumed that the informal education system for refugees is performing excellent. But there are problems within that system. So your point is quite well taken.
Could I add a little here? And I'd like to make 2 points about micro policies around this last discussion that you began, really. One of the things we see in university community partnerships with the schools is that over time, things that begin under the umbrella of funding from the feds, from private foundations, may ultimately become a regular part of school life. And the example I'd like to give is of undergraduate tutors coming to help with math classes in Watsonville, California, which is largely a migrant farm community. And here about every quarter there's about 200 to 300 of our undergraduates from UC Santa Cruz who serve in the classrooms of these schools, helping teachers who often have not been trained in mathematics to teach mathematics. So it's a little delicate matter here. I'll just skip over that part. So the interesting thing is as our Gear Up grants finish up, we've seen the school take up the investment in paying these undergraduates to continue to tutor algebra because the teachers are asking for it. So it's not an after-school assist. It is after-school, but it's also in-school time is augmented by what are often Latino undergraduates, by the way, giving back. So they're very animated to do that. So that's one little, if you will, micro policy. The other event I'd like to say is that actually some families are not comfortable coming to school. And so I would want to say then that one of the things I want to give props to is the work of our colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, who have what they call pláticas, conversations with parents, Latino parents about college at the laundromats, at the libraries, at community centers, but frankly not at school, because school is not a place where they feel safe, at least at the outset. And so what I think is really nice is to expand or to be much more creative about the use of space. And again, these might be micro policies about the use of space and time as well as money. So one of my, I guess my big point is let's rethink what we mean by the word policy and think about the investments that we can make. That maybe, what do you do with your Thursday afternoons? There's really lots of small decisions may add up to a community's investments in its children.
I have a question that I think it maybe unites some of the questions about NAFTA that you mentioned briefly yesterday, and then the question about depopulation. And I'm really concerned about the consequences in origin communities when there's depopulation, and I think someone has used this term of nursing homes and nurseries and nothing in between. And wondering about whether allowing maybe policies that would allow more cyclical migration again, if that is going to be an answer, or if NAFTA has had such an impact that wouldn't necessarily solve the issue of areas that have been essentially underdeveloped that had been more developed in the past.
I think that the ghost towns are not going to come back except as tourist destinations. The ones that are gone. And the problem is probably to prevent more from happening. I think that on that sense, both the development of that policy, a policy that encourages circular migration, we believe has to be bilateral. It involves both a temporary labor program with clear incentives for return for labor migrants so they can come to the harvest and return home, but also a clear participation by the government of Mexico and the state governments to create infrastructure in places of origin, especially education and health, for families to remain and for people to be able to come back. The operating word is that for migrants to return and make a contribution, there has to be something to return to. That is, if there is nothing left or there is something minimal, what's the point? You bring your family and that's it. So there has to be, and in that part, that is something that it cannot be done from this side. It has to be done as well from the side of the sending country, in this case the government of Mexico in particular, that is the major sending country. And this, actually, there is an important start in that direction, which is the 341 program. The 341 program is working well. It's for those who don't, every dollar that migrants contribute for works of infrastructure and philanthropy in their sending towns and so on, they get, that project gets $3, one from the Mexican federal government, one from the state, and one from the municipality. And that has contributed to significant works of infrastructure there. More needs to be done, but I think that is an important element in terms of preventing more from happening. That's at the core of the debate of the relationship between migration and development. As you know, there is a big debate. Some people say that migration is terrible. It's not only a symbol of underdevelopment, but it creates underdevelopment by this question of the population and so on. Others stole the benefits of migration because of remittances and contributions and so on. The key factor is whether it's permanent or cyclical. That is lie at the core of when migration can make a contribution to development. And incidentally, without belaboring the point, the same is true for professional labor migration as well.
Very quickly, if I can just add, what I said yesterday, if I remember correctly, was that the fundamental flaw in many of us, I mean, it's not necessarily that you needed to be a rocket scientist. I mean, there was enough information to understand that a treaty like the North American Free Trade Agreement that did not include provisos for labor was going to have extremely deleterious consequences. I mean, it was just a question of waiting. So that what the North American Free Trade Agreement produced is exactly what's happening, and that is it's been a big win for educated populations on both sides of the border, but it has had very mixed and possibly on the balance negative effects on particularly agricultural workers, but also other kinds of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. So what is particularly egregious is the idea that somehow we are pointing the finger at lawbreakers on an individual basis when in fact the not including labor provisions in NAFTA virtually guaranteed that there was going to be that kind of push factor moving immigrants to the United States. And it's even more surprising considering that by then Europe, and again I qualify this by saying I realize that there are flaws in the European situation, but it's not the kinds of flaws that we are experiencing, in which those economies were able to establish multilateral agreements in order to make sure that there was not going to be a rush of labor from less developed to more developed countries in Europe. So that the bottom line is this will not be resolved. I mean, it's easy to point the finger at the Mexican government and to argue that somehow the Mexican government is corrupt and it should be responsible for its own people. But what is required here is a bilateral agreement. After all, we're speaking about two economies that have a history of interpenetration. This is a peaceful country with which we have a 2,000-mile border, and from which we derive all the advantages that some of the speakers have been describing, including the keynote address, and that is that these are immigrants who come and frankly do not organize resistance movements in order to topple the American government. I mean, they're not exactly the Irish Republican Army. And yet we are trying the patience of immigrants themselves, because without a bilateral agreement, I don't think that we can make progress in creating some of these things, either manage flow of migrant labor or the idea of a circular migration flow.
Can I just add one thing about NAFTA? I don't know if some of our law colleagues are here, but from what I can glean, one of the major difficulties with NAFTA also is that in a wink it has leveled the distinction between national governments and corporations in terms of judicial standing. That in effect, I mean, Canada is also part of NAFTA. What has happened is that the various provisions in NAFTA permit corporations to sue national governments if they do not provide sufficiently fair trade, friendly environments, etc. So this agreement has to come under scrutiny for a major overhaul. It has many consequences that have been hidden, from the eye. And this is also one of them. It's the demolition, or if you wish, it is the reduction of the significance of the public sector and its simply equation in the eyes of the law with the private corporation.
Another question?
I'd just like to ask the effect, if we allowed workers to come in, as I understood, you said for 5 years and then go home, what would happen to the families they left? They were gone, the workers were gone that long. That seems to be terribly disruptive. Are you planning for them just to come during certain seasons and then go back again during that same year? I didn't understand whether that was a permanent 5-year stay in the United States or just partially each year.
Thanks, Barbara.
No, actually, what happened during the earlier era, when the border was less police and so on, is that workers would come and return every year. And in the case of a temporary labor program, they would have a card, and with that temporary card, they would be free to return home without being persecuted and with having to pay a smuggler to come back. So they certainly would go back. That is natural to return regularly to their families in periods of vacation and so on. But that flow would be, in a sense, a way of helping restore the circular flow. As a matter of fact, let me add that actually in Europe, when Europe started back in the 60s because of a need for labor, something called the guest worker program, the Gastarbeiter program, in Holland, Germany, and France, and so on. Well, that program actually worked very well while it was working, and workers kept going back and forth, including Turkish workers at that time, back and forth from Turkey, back and forth from the Senate, until they got this idea that they were going to finish all of a sudden and forbid and entirely close the border. At that thinking at that time, like in this case, that workers would pick up and go. What happened is that they stayed and then brought their families. So instead of having the earlier circular flow, they created a similar situation with a large Turkish population, a large Moroccan, Algerian population in France, as we are having here. That is, every time that you try to impose, that is a general lesson. every time that one tries to impose by arbitrary force a border when to stop what is a natural flow of economic forces feeding labor demand and labor supply, you will have all kinds of perverse consequences, as we have seen in this case. So a more flexible approach is the one that we have been advocated for that reason, including the possibility for temporary migrants to be able to go home for periods of time to certainly see and visit their families.
It is Friday at 5:30. If we don't let them go and rest, they won't thank us anymore. George, where are you? Would you like to say, close it?
Thank you to our guests. Thank you to community members. Thank you, colleagues, everybody who has made this possible. And indeed, a lot of expressions of gratitude have been uttered throughout these couple of days. But I think those of us in positions of privilege sometimes forget that there are a lot of people who are relatively invisible and who make events like this possible, like our technical people. Yes. And the people who have provided services such as food and so forth. So, I mean, it's wonderful to be able to walk into these situations and know that all of those things are going to be taken care of. So when you have, obviously a lot of those people are not present right now, a few of them are, but if you have an opportunity to thank any of them, please do, because I think that's something that's very easy to forget with events like this. So without any further ado, we'll bring this conference to a close. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. I come a little later. My food is